Everything is just about bolted up on this engine. The last thing I really need to do today, before I can put this back into the actual jet ski itself, is put my valve cover gasket on there and my spark plugs. I'm going to handle that as well while we're here. Not much left to do. We're in the home stretch. I really need being able to drop this in, which we're going to hopefully get to do here not too much farther away from where we're at right now. You'll see I don't have the exhaust manifold on right now. That was easier to remove when I took the engine out. So I took the manifold off before I pulled the engine, and we're going to put that back in once I have the engine drop down onto the brand new engine mounts that SBT has provided. We'll talk a little bit about what those engine mounts can do if they go bad, so you know some of the symptoms, but we do have brand new ones in, and I'll show you when we put this in when we put the engine back into the actual hull itself.
This season of Project X is brought to you by SBT, the largest supplier of high-quality jet ski parts in the world.
So I'm going to start by installing my new valve cover gasket. New valve cover gasket's all molded as one piece, including my spark plug well seals. These are your number one culprit. If you have a problem where maybe you were doing a spark plug service and you notice some oil down in that spark plug tube itself, it could be an indication that these have gone bad and you might just need to replace the valve cover itself. But since we did a major engine rebuild, we're installing a brand new one as well. There is a right and a wrong way to install this gasket, surprisingly. And if you look at it, some of you will have a little bit of a smaller indentation. That's where that's going to lie in there. Goes right in the groove, presses right into place. No sealant is required to hold the gasket in place. However, in the corners over here, I am going to put a little bit of RTV in the corners. As it is recommended to do so. And while I have the valve cover gasket off, I'm going to install my new guide stopper. This essentially kind of rides up here on the chain, but it sits actually down here in the valve cover. So I'm just going to install a new one. Just presses into place. No special tools required. I've already cleaned off my surface area up here as well to ensure that I didn't have any leftover debris. And these are the spots. You've got 4 spots right here where you've got this larger gasket coming out a little bit. Right in the corners is where I want to put a little bit of RTV just to give it a little bit more in those corner areas. The old gasket you could look at and see it was evident there, and the service information also says go ahead and put a little bit on those corners itself. Don't need a lot, but I am using the gray RTV. Before I drop this into place, there is one thing you need to do, and you'll see over here I've got part of the gasket that goes all the way over there. If I left it into place, it would hit on top of my chain, so we're just going to snip that off as it's not needed, and it'll just get in the way, so we can snip that off. And now this is ready to put back into place. And just like everything else, make sure you torque to specifications. So there's just one last thing I want to do before I actually get ready to put this back into the hull, and I just want to go ahead and put my spark plugs in now. My friends over at Autolite provided me some brand new Iridium XP spark plugs. So I'm upgrading the ignition a little bit on this machine right now. These are wonderful spark plugs. I highly recommend them. Anytime you're doing spark plugs though, you always want to make sure you're torquing them to correct specifications. And also, I'm going to double check the gap on these to make sure that they're where they need to be before I install them. These ones are at 31 to 35 is my specifications on these. We're just going to double check them, put them in there, torque it down, get my coil on plugs back on, and then we'll be ready to put this thing back into the hull. Again, thanks to Autolite for helping us out with this. Nothing like a great new set of spark plugs on an old engine, and especially moving up to the Iridiums. Highly recommend these. Now pay attention when you're using something that has such a fine wire as these Iridium XP plugs. You don't want to use a ramp style gauge. I have a fine wire gauge right here set up to, and right now I'm at 35, and you want to just have just enough, but you don't want to damage this. This is a very small, very thin electrode. So make sure that you're getting just the amount that you need. If you need to adjust it, you would use the tang over here and gently bend it back or the other way to increase your gap. Right now, these are perfect, right where I wanted it to be. It said 31 to 35. I'm right at that 35 right now. Probably just gonna back it down just a hair. And you'll see I'm just gonna be very, very gentle. You have to be very, very careful with these style. I like where that one is. This one's ready to install. Never take a hammer to these or bash it on the bench to decrease that gap. Just be very gentle, take your time. Make sure you're using the tool correctly. Once you've got it where you want it to be, you can put it back in. And we'll repeat that for the other two as well. But I think you get the idea. Always start spark plugs by hand. Don't use any impact tools or any air tools. Start these by hand to make sure that you're not damaging any of the threads. And I'm going to run these all the way down, and then I'm going to torque them. Last step I got to do right now before I get ready to put this back into the hull is I'm going to go ahead and put my coilover plugs back on, torque them into place on the valve cover. And at this point, anything else I need to do will be done in the hull, including my oil filter, which is going to be provided to us by our friends at Fram. We also will need to put our exhaust manifold back on, all our exhaust components, and of course, all the wiring and hoses that go with this. But right now, you got to watch us take this from a complete removal, tear down, all new components provided to us by SBT. You saw us put in new rings, new connecting rods, crankshaft, camshafts, new timing chain. We watched how to do the timing on this. We watched how to use some plastic gauge, an important thing to check your oil clearances with. You got to meet some new people along the way, like my friend Eric, who helped out quite a bit, and Brian, who helped out quite a bit on this engine as well. I'm sure you're going to see them again, as I'm going to need a hand or two when we get this back into the hull. Stay tuned for that. As you can see, we've got our engine ready to be reinstalled into the hull. You'll also notice I have a 3-point setup on here because we do need to tilt the motor a little bit. It's also why I have this adjustable handle that's going to allow me to put a little bit of a tilt on this, because when you kind of tilt it in and slide it in and then get it set on its mounts. Speaking of motor mounts, SBT has provided us a brand new set of motor mounts for this engine. You know, after 8 years of riding on this ski, you're gonna get a little bit of possibly wear to your mounts. So SBT has provided us a brand new set. These are a little bit more rigid than the other style that we took off of here. Some of the indications that you have a failed motor mount include possibly some excessive engine movement. And that would also possibly create a little bit of a clunk type noise, especially during engagement, when I'm engaging my actual impeller housing to the motor itself. With that engine being able to move like that with bad motor mounts, you're putting excessive stress on all the components down here, which is going to lead to failure of those bearings, possibly the impeller itself or the impeller shaft. All of those things are going to be wore down faster with bearings or with motor mounts that have failed. So it's important, hey, while I have them out, SBT has given us some new ones. I'm going to install these in the hull first, and then we're going to start dropping our motor back in, hooking up all of our components back to the engine itself, including our fuel, our electrical, and ignition. One last thing to keep in mind when you're installing your new engine mounts, on some of these Yamaha jet skis, you may find shims that were in between the mount there and in here. If there were shims, make sure you put them back where they were in the original location. Now this ski did not have any, so I don't have any to put back into place. I'm still gonna wanna double check though that my clearance right here is going to be okay when I get this into place. So we'll take a look at that once we get it into place. We'll kind of leave the mount a little loose, and I'm gonna make sure that all my clearances are okay here before I really start bolting it back into place. That's gonna take a little bit of time once I get this dropped in though. So you can see we have our engine installed back in our hull. That went a lot easier than I anticipated. We also installed our new motor mounts. Now before I torque down the motor mounts, there are a couple of critical things that you need to do to make sure that everything's lined up and that there's going to be no damage when we do fire up the ski. One of those things is your coupling. Your coupling and your engine and your impeller assembly, they basically have teeth. And if you look in the service manual, there's a specification for them. But those teeth have to mesh together in a certain way. Now, when they come together, there's a specification for the measurement on that. And you don't want them to be one where the engine might be higher or lower. You also don't want it skewed either left or right too much, because then you're going to put way too much stress and cause damage to the impeller housing, the bearings, all of those things that we just replaced and just redid. So that, especially when you put them together, you're gonna have your rubber mount in there, and you want a specification. I don't want it to be tight. We don't want it like this. And conversely, I don't want them too far spread out either, or too far away. The specification you can find in the service manual is 0.079 to 157, I believe, and I am right. So you want to take your feeler gauges, and I kind of split the difference on them to use this as the thickness that I wanted to insert. So again, I'm going to measure that distance between these two, and I do it in multiple locations, and that ensures that I am not left or right or up and down. So I make sure you go around, and this is why your engine mounts are loose. I want to be able to have the flexibility. If I was off a little bit, I could move that engine a little bit to compensate for that distance. So we want it just perfect, that they're not too tight and way not too loose. And again, that specification, I split the difference on that, and around the 120 mark is where I left mine, around 120, 125, something like that. And again, I was going to measure that distance all the way around. Once I was satisfied, and once you're satisfied with that, then you can go ahead and torque your motor mounts down to your 12.5 foot-pounds. We were satisfied with this. I didn't require any shims. Now, if your ski came with shims underneath the motor mounts, make sure you put them back where they were so that you can compensate for any irregularities that was accomplished at the factory. If you do have some irregularities, you might need to get a shim package. You can get that from SBT, and they can help you out with that as well. Everything lined up here really well. I've got it where I wanted it to. I've torqued down my motor mounts. My engine is in. Everything's reinstalled. Essentially, I'm ready to fire it up. That'll be coming soon. Stay tuned.